Graeme Garrard. Welcome to the
Sure.
podcast.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you for being here. And there's something that I wanted to speak to you about that has actually interested me for quite a while, and that is power dynamics and how power could corrupt just about anyone. You do mention that power is not always bad. Sometimes it could be used for good. From what I've seen is that oftentimes if you give a group of people or an individual absolute power, it could corrupt them. But I just wanted to get your opinion on that before we begin. There's also another thing that I wanted to speak to you about, and it is the Luigi Mangione case and the murder of the United Healthcare CEO. But before we get into that, just what is your opinion on power dynamics and how it could be used to corrupt just about anyone?
Right. Well, you're referring there to a famous quotation from Lord Acton in the 19th century, English liberal, who said famously, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. An often quoted remark by him. And it's true, I think. It can corrupt. He said it tends to corrupt. People usually don't. People usually take the word tends out to. It
Hmm.
means that it isn't necessarily corrupt. It has a tendency to corrupt,
Hmm.
and I think that's probably true. Um, but um, so one has to be careful because its power enables people to oppress others, to
Hmm.
dominate them, to usurp their own power, etc. So there are dangers inherent in power. That's true, and I think it is a temptation, and therefore it can corrupt, and very often does corrupt those who possess it. That's, I
Right.
suppose, one of the main themes of Lord of the Rings. You know,
Right.
the ring is meant to symbolize power. So the people who come close to it uh, become demented with power. They find it irresistible, and it corrupts them. That's sort of the theme of the whole series, perhaps anyway. So I like to argue that in addition to that, one should also say that um, uh, lack of power corrupts, and absolute lack of power corrupts absolutely. By which
Hmm.
I mean that um, an excess of power is dangerous,
Right.
but insufficiency or too little power is also dangerous, and that's because power can be used for both good and bad. It can be
Hmm.
used to destroy. It can also be used to create. In fact, you can't do anything without power. Um, and so, if you go too far in limiting power, you dispossess yourself of the ability to achieve good things.
Hmm.
Also, if there are large concentrations of power at various places in society, the best eh, one way, or perhaps the best way to counter that power is with power,
Hmm.
counter power.
Right.
And therefore you may need to increase power in certain areas in order to decrease it in others.
Yeah.
So this is one of the problems with um, private and public power is that if you believe that the state is a threat to the freedoms and rights of individuals because it has so much power, as the American revolutionaries believed, they believed that King George, and the British Parliament had too much power, were oppressing them. And so they designed a political system to inherently um, weaken the power of the state, the power of the government, through checks and balances. They eventually adopted a Bill of Rights, federalism, various ways to disperse and weaken the power of the state because they saw that as oppressive. But
Hmm.
what happens if power resides elsewhere? Private power, a
Hmm.
power in our own time, in 2025, the dominant form of private power in the world are large multinational corporations,
Hmm.
many of which are wealthier than most countries in the world.
Yeah.
the biggest ones, the largest ones anyway. Um, so there, if you reduce the power of the state, you're increasing the power, private power. And that's not necessarily going to free people up. It's not necessarily going to liberate people. It's simply going to make them more vulnerable to other forms of power, private power.
Right.
So it's not so straightforward as, well, let's reduce the power of the state and create a space for people to be free so that they
Mhm.
are empowered.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way quite so straightforwardly. Very often, in reducing the power of the state, you increase the power of private corporations, which can be tyrannical themselves.
Mhm.
So, my view is that you need power. Power is both a good and a bad. It's potentially used in good and bad ways. You can't achieve anything without power, but you can, of course, oppress and destroy with power too. So the question is, what's the best or optimal balance or distribution of power?
Right.
Because we live in a world where institutions and bodies and agencies and entities are all extremely big.
Yeah. So
Big
you've
governments, big corporations. So you can't just address one, you've got to address them all. But how do you
mhm.
tackle those without power? How do you limit power without the use of power?
Right.
So there doesn't seem to me there's a simple way out of this dilemma, just simply reducing power so that people are free or dispersing power. Because that in a way just shifts the power into other hands.
Mhm. So you've made various interesting points, and one of those points was the power between governments and corporations. And you can't have a weakened government because then you'll give rise to the private corporations to have the power. And also, George Washington's famous for being against the two-party system, which is something that I actually disagree on him about, because having a two-party system gives a challenge to our government. At least that's what I've seen. So you can't have unchecked power, and that's why we have the checks and balances. So creating a two-party system, although they often disagree, that's actually good for discourse, because there's going to be often disagreements. And if you have a party or people in government that no one disagrees on him about, at least in government, you just have unchecked power, and they will run off with it. And the point that you made of the government and power in government and then power in corporations relates to the Luigi Mangione case, and why so many people support Luigi. They may not necessarily support the murder of a person, but they support him in the sense that they're overcharging him to make an example out of him. And another point that you made was, the Lord of the Rings film, and to take it to current times, something that's going on right now, at least in the media or multimedia, I should say, it's the TV show or the Netflix show of Squid Game, which shows us power dynamics as well. So those are several points that you made. So I don't know if you've watched Squid Game, but you have a group of people competing against each other, and those who lose during the game die. But because there's a prize, which in U.S. currency is like millions of dollars, and they'll rather face death than go home with the money that they've won so far. So every time after a game, after people die, there's a piggy bank that money is deposited into, uh, and they're given a choice whether to continue playing these games. That there's a chance that they get killed, or they survive and go on to the next round to win this prize money. but it's all tied into a a group of people that are called the VIPs that bet against each other. And they're betting. You have this group of people that are competing for the money that have issues with gambling, and they're in debt for the most part. So now they're competing, and if they die, they die. If they die, they lose. So that's a whole thing. And it's really interesting how power gets played. And although that doesn't really exist, there's no games that, at least from my knowledge, that you have a group of people competing, and if they lose, they die, and if they keep winning, they go on to the next round and win some cash. But it is related to what's going on right now, that you have a group of people that is detached from the issues of another group of people. And I feel that is related to the Luigi Mangione case, which I'm very interested to talk in talking to you about, because you have a pretty wealthy individual who worked for this corporation, and he made several decisions while working in that corporation that affected the lives of people who did not have the privilege to keep on living just because of their situation. So, say, for example, if a cancer patient needed chemotherapy and they had stage 4 cancer, you had this insurance company who would rather have them die or delay the insurance payout, because if they paid out any money towards that person, they'd make less profit. So you have Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare, making all these decisions. He gets killed. And for the most part, society at large does not feel any sympathy for his murder. And in turn, they support the person who they're alleging murdered the CEO. So it shows how people at large are tired of those other people that have the power, and they use power to corrupt society.
Right. Well, look, first of all, on the first point you were making about the party system, the two-party system or two-party plus system, yeah, I agree. So when you've got two basic forms of power, one is private and one is public, and the dominant form of public power is the state, and the dominant form of private power today are large multinational corporations. One thing to be said for public power in that form is that in democracies, the people who dominate, who are the most powerful, who have the most public power, are accountable to voters. And also, much of what they do, obviously not all of it, but a large part of it is transparent. It's open. There's supposed to be, at least in principle, open government. So this means that there are checks on the abuse of that power, which is not to say it doesn't happen. Of course it does. You still get abuses of power. States do trample on the rights of their citizens and engage in illegal wars and things like that. But in a democratic state, there is this check. And of course, a two-party system or multi-party system is one of those checks, because
Right.
there are always alternative governments that can be voted in to replace a corrupt or incompetent government. The same is not true of private power. The people who wield that power are not elected or not accountable to the general public, and
Right.
also very much of what they do is secret. It's not available to the public to scrutinize. So, and it's not accountable. And so there is more reason, other things being equal, to trust public power than private power. I'm not saying I favor one over the other. Both
Mm-hmm.
will exist, both need to exist, but there's something to be said for the democratic nature of public power in a democracy. That's my first point.
Mm-hmm.
Regarding Luigi Mangione, now he has just a little caveat. He has pleaded not guilty. So
Mm-hmm.
so he's entitled to the presumption of innocence. So we 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 shouldn't talk about him as if he were guilty, but we
Right.
can talk hypothetically. If he goes to trial and he's found guilty
Mm-hmm.
of murdering Brian Thompson, who's the CEO of United Healthcare, as you say, then what? What can we conclude from that? Well, um, I would be tempted to interpret that um, uh, as a kind of political act on his part. I'm not aware of any personal connection between him, Luigi Mangione, and Brian Thompson. I'm not aware from the things I've read in the news. That's all I have access to. That there was a particular personal reason that he, if he's guilty, he did it. That was his motive for killing him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if that's true, and he is guilty, I think it's fair to draw the inference that he was making a statement in targeting that particular individual.
Right.
So what was the statement that he's trying to make? Well, um, you're too young to remember the financial crisis, I
Mm-hmm.
assume, from 2008, but there was an enormous reservoir of anger and resentment over that. The entire economy of the industrialized West nearly collapsed because of the greed and folly of um, of both governments and private businesses and banks. The banks and private businesses, the investment companies, hedge funds, and the like, mortgage companies, were reckless and selfish and paid no regard to long-term public interest.
Mm-hmm.
And governments failed to check this, to regulate it, or to stop it until it was too late. And the whole house of cards very nearly collapsed. They nearly crashed the entire economy. And this caused a huge wave of anger.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also the Occupy Wall Street movement, which also expressed a rage against the same system.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably don't remember that one either because you're too young, but I certainly remember it. And there's Bernie Sanders' campaign for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party. He tapped in, as I understand it anyway, he tapped into that same sense of anger, that
Mm-hmm.
rage. So what was it that I think all of these things had in mind that was motivating them to be so angry, to have such resentment? Um, well, I think it's a sense that the system was rigged,
Mm-hmm.
that there were people uh, who had enormous amount of power and wealth, which of course often go together, and they were wielding it in their own interests and against the interests of virtually everyone else. And they couldn't lose. It was a heads I win, tails you lose situation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they were so rich and so well placed that they could influence governments. So it was very difficult for ordinary people to appeal to their governments to assist in controlling these forces, to regulate them better, to improve their behavior, because they were being lobbied
Mm-hmm.
heavily by those same forces, these private corporations. I mean, we know this, particularly in Washington, where
Right.
it's rife and very well established and extremely well funded. Um, and people were powerless. As I said before, these corporations are not democratic entities. They are extremely powerful. They wield great power, but it's not democratic power. It's totally privately, it's in private hands, and it's not accountable, and it's not transparent, and often deliberately obscure. And so I think there's a feeling of frustration that power and wealth were becoming so unevenly distributed,
Hmm.
and that those who had the greatest power were using it not for any public good, but for their own private gain, to enrich and further empower themselves. And that those who were disempowered, the vast majority, were getting increasingly frustrated with this system. And it was obvious from the financial crisis and
Right.
since that it's a rigged game, um, that it's not a fair game. The rules are
Hmm.
biased. And so getting to Mangione, um,
Hmm.
you could interpret his actions, if indeed he was guilty and if indeed his motive was to make a kind of statement, as a further expression, albeit a very extreme one, um, of anger and um, uh, resentment against that system,
Hmm.
of which Brian Thompson was to Mangione a symbol, a perfect symbol of someone who, uh, was playing by rules that were rigged.
Right.
That people in good faith took out, private insurance with his company, and then when they got ill, they were told they couldn't make claims. They were forced to go to courts. They were they were often die or get their sicknesses were prolonged, all because these corporations were so rich and so powerful that ordinary people couldn't take them on. They
Yeah.
didn't have the money to hire the lawyers and the advocates, and they didn't have the time either if they were gravely ill. Um, so I would be, I mean, that's one way to look at it, that
Hmm.
Mangione's popularity, if you want, with a lot of people, um, is connected to this general feeling that the system is rigged, that it's unfair. There are asymmetries of wealth and power that are extreme and getting worse, and that people feel impotent. They feel powerless or
Right.
disempowered against the system. And so, in killing Brian Thompson, you're not destroying the system because he's just one cog in that system,
Right.
but you are making a statement of by symbolically killing someone who is a kind of, for many people, a perfect embodiment of everything that's wrong with that system.
So something really I would say fascinating is happening with this case because although the murder of Brian Thompson does not really change what happens with the insurance companies, it definitely brings into discussion what happened. And media companies, who we know have been for so long been funded by pharmaceutical companies and just the health industry overall, they have to bring into discussion the motive because you can't talk about
Mhm.
Luigi Mangione without discussing the motive of what he did and why he did it. Now, you
Mhm.
have Luigi Mangione, who has been overcharged for this case. He has been charged with second degree, which I don't disagree with because, if there's a murder that takes place, uh, in New York specifically, you can't charge someone with first degree murder, even though it's a premeditated murder. It's just second degree, and first degree is used more of an enhancement when you kill like a police officer or
Mhm.
you commit a murder in the furtherance of terrorism. So
Mhm.
what did they do? They charged them with second degree murder and second degree murder with the furtherance of terrorism that got that charge enhanced to a first degree murder charge. So they definitely overcharged them. And now that we see that, uh, they're making a spectacle out of him and trying to make an example out of this. Uh, but the only example that I'm seeing is that you don't kill rich people. That's what I'm getting because ever since that happened, there's been some public cases come out of New York. Uh, Two people, there may be more, were burnt alive in the subway system. I just read about this other case that someone just ran up to some 14-year-old kid and stabbed him in the heart. So things have happened since, but they chose this particular case to make a spectacle out of this, which basically just makes it look like you don't kill rich people. Because if the person that died in the subway was not a homeless person and was a wealthy individual, then the narrative would be different. But now there's a risk, and public at large does not feel a sense of terror in what Luigi Mangione did. It's specifically a group of people, and that group of people is the group that holds the power. So I think they did a mistake with overcharging him, because I feel that society at large, or the American people, would look at that case and see a second degree murder for this case as being rational, because that's what happened. But when you get into overcharging him, trying to make an example out of him, it backfires, because now the public sees a sense of taking advantage of this case and just trying to lock him away for as long as possible, just because of who died, not because of what he did.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm not an expert on that, but it didn't look like terrorism to me. It looked like an assassination. Most of the times, political assassinations have political targets, whereas terrorism does too, but it's generalized. It's meant to instill terror in the general public, often by the use of indiscriminate violence. Driving a truck or a car into a crowd, or exploding a bomb in a crowd or something. In this case, it was just targeted. It was targeted at a particular individual and a particular type of individual. I think part of the problem is that the American legal system is so politicized. The United States, I think, is the only country in the world, it's the only one I can think of, where public prosecutors are elected.
Mm-hmm.
And so that automatically makes them political. And they're the
Right.
ones who decide who gets prosecuted. And they have to get elected,
Mm-hmm.
and they need money to get elected, which means they're dependent on campaign contributions,
Right.
many of which come from those who can afford to make them, which are the rich, often in corporations. There's a reason these large corporations spend so much money on political contributions,
Mm-hmm.
campaign contributions, donations, if you want, to political parties and to lobbying governments at all
Yeah.
levels. They wouldn't spend that money otherwise. They don't do it because they don't know what to do with their money. They do it for good
Right.
reason. So I think this situation was destined to become politicized. I mean, very many
Mm-hmm.
things in the American criminal justice system end up politicized because of this problem of electing public prosecutors and judges. Some judges anyway get elected.
Yeah.
I think that's asking for trouble. And so as soon as Brian Thompson was killed, I knew right away, I'm sure everyone did,
Mm-hmm.
that this would become politicized.
Yeah.
And the public prosecutors in the United States, being political in their nature, would have had the same thought immediately as well,
Right.
which may explain why they were so keen to bring the full force of the law down on his head by adding the charge of terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's questionable if that was really an act of terror. It's a debatable point, but that was probably for political reasons. They don't want this sort of thing to become an example
Right.
that might lead to other assassinations, essentially political assassinations,
Mm-hmm.
because of its obviously political nature.
Yeah.
And I'm saying this assuming there isn't a personal connection between that company or that individual, Brian Thompson, and
Mhm.
Mangione. I don't know. I'm just assuming there wasn't. I'm just assuming that he picked him as a symbolic target.
Right.
Um, and if he did, yeah, you're absolutely right. You have to then go straight to the question of motive,
Hmm.
and that becomes a political issue then, because his motive was likely an anger against a system that he perceived as unfair.
Yeah. So the U.S.
And
political.
sorry, one last
Oh,
point there.
go ahead.
Before, just to interrupt you quickly, and I think a lot of people have that reaction, and I think it's a natural reaction. And so I think that explains why there's a great deal of public sympathy,
Yeah.
is that people are assuming that was his motive.
Right.
We don't know for certain, so that has to be determined. But I think a lot of people assuming that's his motive and don't see that as such a bad motive. Now, it may
Uh-huh.
not, no one, most people are not going to then go and get a gun and kill someone, thank goodness. But I think people are looking at, why did he do this? He is a man of great promise, from what I've
Hmm.
read. He, was achieved quite a bit and was in a position of considerable
Right.
privilege himself. So I think I understand that. I'm not saying I condone it, but
Hmm.
it's very understandable.
Yeah. So the U.S. political system is very interesting because it gives us the illusion of choice, but how much of that choice is influenced by the media? Now, when the rise of Facebook was happening, Facebook started in 2004, but we didn't really see the rise of it until late 2009, around 2010. That's when more people started to get on Facebook. We've had a couple other platforms before. There was MySpace, there was Friendster, but Facebook was really revolutionary because a greater amount of people now were connected online. When that was happening, I thought what was going to happen was that people were going to have greater access to information. So they were less likely to be lied to because they could just have the right, straight away answer to any of their questions. But that didn't happen. I feel that misinformation just rose along with that. So now there was a huge issue with people's confirmation bias, and they ignored any other contradictory information of what they already believed. So whatever they believed, they just paid attention to what confirmed their beliefs. So that happened. And now what we saw before social media, it's greater. So, we're able to go to the ballot box and vote however we want. But how much of that choice is actually influenced to our environment and to what we're told to believe? And that's why Trump won in 2016. He lost in 2020. He recently won again. They tried to make him out to look like a bad guy. Uh, and people were tired of that. They saw through the veil. I don't know. It's a huge issue. But how much of that choice is actually just influenced by corporate power?
Well, the short answer is a lot, uh, because we're bombarded relentlessly by messages, by advertising, and by social media and the internet. The channels of communication are now vastly more numerous and
Hmm.
relentless and pervasive than they used to be.
Right.
Um, so we're all subject. I mean, they've done studies of this. I can't quote you the facts and figures offhand, but I have seen the evidence of how much of this we are subject to on a daily
Hmm.
basis. How many adverts you see in an average day. It's, for example, it's just enormous. So it's everywhere. The public sphere has been invaded colonized by this sort of thing. And so that has bound to influence people very heavily. But what's changed, you mentioned Facebook. I mean, what's changed from when I was young, when I was your age, there were far fewer channels of communication. They were a small number of newspapers in each city. There were a small number of networks that people watched on the television. There was no internet when I was growing up. And so it's not that the media was unbiased then and has become biased now. That's not true. The media has always been biased. It's necessarily biased.
Yeah.
Because you can't report the whole truth. You always have to pick and choose. When you report something, you're always reporting part of the truth. And in doing that, you are misleading your audience. There's no way around that either. So what's happened, though, is that the media is and always was and always will be biased in certain directions. What's changed is that it's not as concentrated. It's much more dispersed. So people have more options and can choose the biases they want. And they're, as you said, they're choosing based on their own preferences, beliefs, biases, choosing those avenues of communication. And so they're getting the message reinforced and reinforced. They're not listening to CNN 1 minute and then listening to Fox and then triangulating. Okay, the truth maybe lies. I get part of the truth from CNN, I get part of the truth from Fox, and then I kind of build a composite picture of the truth. No, they're not. Very few people do that. It seems to me, they're finding the channel, the podcasts, the YouTube channels, the whatever it is that they like, that confirm their biases, and that they're being reinforced. They're being fed a narrative. They're being shown evidence that supports that narrative and only that narrative, and so that just reinforces their bias.
Right.
And of course, power in that case is more dispersed because it's not just a few large media corporations that determine that. It's a lot more individuals who can disseminate information, disseminate narratives than there used to be. But of course, the platforms that they use are extremely concentrated and monopolistic or oligopolistic in a very few hands. And this is a big problem as well. The number of voices out there has gone up, is proliferated, but they are operating through these forums that are controlled by a very small number of people, mostly in private hands.
Yeah.
And they are variously accused of bias and censorship and the like. So the problem hasn't gone away, but it's become more complex because of changes in technology, viewing habits, etc. There's still a disproportionate concentration of power at the top here, but it's got to be combined with the proliferation of voices within the forums that they own and control.
No, yeah. I totally agree. And now with the rise of different voices and many more voices, many more people that we had access to even 10 years ago, now we tend to believe or trust certain voices. So if I'm listening to a podcast and I routinely listen to that podcast, it just takes for them to spread just a little piece of misinformation. And because they're a trusted voice, at least to me, I'll believe that and I'll go on, and that's the information that I believe. So it's very critical to question certain narratives, even from those we trust the most. And, there's been studies that, if you see someone in public or if you go to a doctor's office, they're wearing a lab coat, that's a trusted individual. So you tend to believe whatever they tell you. If they tell you to take this medicine, you're just going to take it without really asking any questions. If you see someone wearing a suit, you tend to believe that they're actually a trusted individual, stuff like that. But the same thing is happening with certain podcasters that, someone may spread a rumor that they actually take on, then they tell someone else, but that may not be accurately or that may not be accurate. Now they're spreading that misinformation, and because you trust that voice, that's the information that you take and believe to be true. So that's also an issue. Sometimes it may not be malicious. They just not be may not be informed correctly, but it may happen.
Does happen all the time. Yeah. I mean, the world is complex, so we can't individually investigate everything ourselves.
Yeah.
I can't do a in-depth study of nuclear power to determine whether it's a good thing or not. I have to defer to expert knowledge. In a complex world, it's necessary. You mentioned the lab coats and the scientific authority that we often defer to. So you'll probably be familiar with the famous Milgram experiments in the
Yeah.
1960s and 70s. That's where they brought in volunteers and put them in a lab. And for your viewers who don't know this, they said, in return for a small payment, they were doing an experiment. So they had these volunteers sit at a panel that allowed them to deliver electric shocks to someone else in another room, whom they could communicate with on a intercom.
Yeah.
And then the scientists in their lab coats with their clipboards would issue instructions to these volunteers and say, okay, please deliver shock level 1, the minimum. And they could hear the reaction. They couldn't see it. They could hear the reaction. And so the experiment was designed to test to what degree will average members of the general public, to what degree will they defer to the orders of authoritative figures, in this case, scientists. Of course, they were all fake. They were all actors. In doing things that were harming other people. And so the reason it became famous is that the shocking conclusion was that people were very ready to defer to these experts, these authority figures, because they were authoritative.
Yeah.
And so some of them were delivering huge shocks that could potentially cause great harm, even potentially kill innocent people they'd never met, these volunteers. Of course, it was all fake. But, and why? Because they were being told to.
Yeah.
There was nothing at stake. It was just an experiment. There was nothing at stake. They weren't saving the world. So the point is, we, in a very complex world where we have access to lots of channels of communication, we really it's not unreasonable for people to want to seek authorities who will explain or simplify the world, because we can't do it individually. We don't have the expertise, the breadth, the time, and so you get, as a response to that, you get a lot of these figures claiming authority, and people defer to it. It happens in elections. A lot of people don't have the inclination or the time to go and study all the issues in depth before they make up their minds. So they look for proxies, right?
Right.
They look, who do I trust? Who do I trust? Who's authoritative to me on this? And I'll do what they say. I'll vote the way they say. That's a feature of this environment. I think it's always been true, but there are, of course, more people claiming authority and wielding authority in this fashion over a public that really isn't equipped to assess very often who's actually knows what they're talking about.
Right. So is power and authority one of the same, or is there a difference?
Well, there's a difference. Usually, the standard definition of authority is power that is legitimate. In other words, some power may not be legitimate in the eyes of those over whom it's wielded. For example, a slave in ancient Athens or Sparta what would have been subject to the power of the citizens of that city, of those cities, but wouldn't necessarily have been regarded that power as legitimate because they were forced into it. I mean, who would volunteer to be a slave? If you volunteered to be a slave, you weren't a slave, right? You were just a servant. So they were forced by sheer power to be slaves, whereas we are subject to the power of the state, but we don't see ourselves as slaves. We do it because we regard that power as legitimate. And how is it made legitimate? How does it become authoritative to us? Through the ballot box, through the practice of democracy. We go through a process and we accept the outcome. Well, Donald Trump is notorious for not accepting the outcome, but we accept the outcome because even when we lose, our guy loses. We know that the process has been followed and the outcome is legitimate. So when they wield power, we may not like it, but we accept it because we consider it authoritative power. It's legitimate power.
Yeah.
So power is a kind of brute fact, whereas authority is normative. It's something that we accept as legitimate.
Yeah. Wow.
And of course, one last point here:
Go ahead.
No state can govern just relying on brute power.
No,
because it's inherently unstable. That's why the Spartans were always nervous about their very large class of slaves. They called them the helots. They were always nervous because they knew that the second that they let their guard down, they'd all be murdered, right? So all the citizens would be murdered. So states need legitimacy. They need their power to be authoritative. And so it's important to maintain the legitimacy of the state. So in democracy, it's important that the processes of democracy are regarded as legitimate.
Yeah.
And when Trump questioned those in recent elections or 2020 election, that raised questions about the legitimacy of the office of president.
Right.
Because he said that he won, the other guy didn't win. So that makes people nervous because the whole legitimacy of the state is then brought into question.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. No matter what side of the political spectrum you are in, you always need power to be challenged. And, if I vote a certain way, I still want the other side to be there, even though I would want my the side that I support to have all the power, because I wouldn't necessarily have the same beliefs on issues as the other side does, but we still need power to be challenged no matter who you are. But, I've really enjoyed our conversation and discussing power because it's definitely a very interesting topic to discuss. But thank you so much for coming on. And, one last thing, where can people find your books?
Oh, no, Amazon would be the easiest way. They're all there. So you can just Google my name or type in my name, and that'll bring it up on Amazon. I have 4 books published, so they'll find them all there. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. But thank you so much for joining me and having this discussion with me.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
Yeah, it's definitely been fun. But thank you.